So with this, now we move on to the next one, which is authority and bureaucracy, right? Now, if you look at some of the important pointers, the PYQs related to authority and bureaucracy, what I want to quickly draw your attention to is that there is a specific, again, pattern. So if you look at Weber's idea of bureaucracy, so historical experiences of Europe, so they want to kind of look at specifically how you draw the connections between Weber's idea of bureaucracy as something that is distinctly, or his take on the emergence of bureaucracy as something that is distinctly European. Max Weber's idea that bureaucracy has the potential to become an iron cage, forms of legitimate domination. Weber used the notion of ideal types in his theory of bureaucracy, salient features of Weberian bureaucracy. So these are some of the pointers. Let's quickly start with the idea of authority, because bureaucracy is within authority. So basically, Weber is writing about authority in the later part of his academic career. So sometime between 1914 to 1920, that is when he starts attending to the question of authority. And when he's talking about authority, he's primarily looking at, of course, the question of power and domination. So this is something that is very much at the center of his political writings. The question of power, the question of domination, and of course, associated with these questions is the question of authority. And he, just like any other great sociologist, he does not talk about domination, power, and authority simply in the present context, his present context, the erstwhile early 20th century Europe. He talks about it in a historical way. He talks about how we had different structures of authority and forms of authority earlier, and how things changed, and what did that process of transformation lead to. So on the basis of this, Weber talks about various forms of authority, and I'm sure you are already aware of it, but Weber was not generally interested in all forms of domination. He was particularly interested in the legitimate form of domination. So authority is what we call legitimate power or legitimate authority. So this is something that he was interested in, because domination can be carried out from through various ways and through various structures of control and power. But Weber was not interested in everything and anything. He was particularly interested in the legitimate forms of authority that he called domination. And then there is definition of power. So the definition of power that we use, we refer to Weber's definition of power, the ability of an individual to carry out their will in a given situation despite resistance. That's the definition. Please use the source Economy and Society. So Weber refers to this definition in his famous work, Economy and Society. So that's the definition of power. The definition of domination is the probability that certain specific commands or all commands will be obeyed by a given group of persons. That is domination. And both these definitions, the definition of power and the definition of domination, is to be found in Economy and Society, the famous work. Now, Weber focused on various forms of domination that had existed historically. And he did not simply pay attention to only power. So he looked at various forms, and it is in this regard that he draws our attention to charismatic, traditional, and rational legal. And basically, he is talking about every system of domination as different in terms of various aspects of it. So the traditional is different in terms of recruitment, in terms of the following, in terms of the association that people have with the authority, and similarly rational legal, etc. So in terms of the historical differences that we just spoke about, he refers to charismatic, traditional, and rational legal. And Weber argued that each of these types of authority actually has a corresponding form of legitimacy. So the form of legitimacy for charismatic is different as compared to the form of legitimacy for traditional, and as compared to the form of legitimacy of rational legal. So the form of legitimacy is different in each of these. Then the theory, the form of legitimacy, the type of obedience that each of these authorities command. So that's also different from charismatic to traditional to rational legal. Then administrative apparatus. The administrative apparatus of rational legal is very different as compared to the administrative apparatus of rational traditional. And also, so these are so administrative apparatus, the mode of in which power is exercised, the overall form of legitimacy, and the type of obedience. So these are four important aspects that differ from one form of authority to another. And bureaucracy basically comes into the picture when we are discussing rational legal authority. Now, the rational legal authority, of course, is something that Weber characterizes in relation to particularly the modern society. And he says that here, authority basically rests on rational grounds. Authority rests on rational grounds. This is something that Weber is insisting on. Authority rests on rational grounds, and the belief is not in relation to the person. The belief is in the legality of the rules, the enacted rules. So suddenly rules become the most important thing. So the compliance in rational legal authority is not owed to the person who is issuing commands, so those who issue commands. So the compliance is not owed to, or the compliance is not to do with people, persons. The compliance is to do with the laws, right? The compliance is to do with the statutes. It has got nothing to do with the personal authority of the ruler, which is not the case in traditional authority. The compliance is to do with the person. But in rational legal, the compliance is to do with the sanctity and supremacy and the ultimate decisive sort of stature of the rules. So that's your rational legal. Then with bureaucracy as an ideal form, of course, or bureaucracy as an ideal type, you can talk about various features or characteristics of bureaucracy that we have, and Weber has outlined, and I'm sure you already have that in place. You can always point out that the fundamental difference between rational legal and traditional, for example, is that in traditional authority, we had what we call edicts, edicts. So these were personal declarations made by the emperor, the ruler, etc. Whereas in the case of rational legal, we have what we call statutes. So that's an important thing. So you have a statute. So edict is one, and then statute. Edict and statute. So these are some of the important pointers that we have in relation to the rational legal authority. Now, particularly in the context of bureaucracy, if we are now moving on to a specific pointer, if you're talking about bureaucracy, the purest type of exercise. Now, there are a few things that Weber has to say. The purest type of exercise of legal authority, that's what he says. In Economy and Society, Weber points this out. Bureaucracy is something that is capable of attaining the highest degree of efficiency. That is also something that is associated with bureaucracy. Then the most rational known means of exercising authority over human beings. Weber is very clear on this. No machinery in the world, Weber says, functions as precisely or so precisely as bureaucracy or as a bureaucratic apparatus. And also it is very cheap. So Weber is talking about it in terms of its precision and also in terms of its cost-effective operations. Now, Weber wrote for the first time on bureaucracy in the year 1908 in his study on the economies of antiquity. So that's the title of the work, In Economies of Antiquity. For the first time, Weber is writing on bureaucracy, and Weber defined bureaucracy as a highly structured, formalized, and also an impersonal organization. It's a very important point. Impersonal. There is nothing personal about the workings of a bureaucratic organization, ideally speaking. Well, personal things might creep in, but when Weber is defining bureaucracy as an ideal type, he's very clear that it is highly structured, it is formalized, and it is an impersonal organization. And he points out that there are 4 dominant reasons that led to the emergence of bureaucracy. So that might just be of help in relation to understanding historical experiences of Europe. The emergence of a modern economy. So he says, as soon as the modern economy, in other words, as soon as capitalism emerges and acquires a certain presence in Western Europe, bureaucracy is something that has to follow, because in order to kind of control and manage and administer this large collective of human beings, bureaucracy is the ultimate efficient reference point. So the emergence of a modern economy, then the rise of civil politics, that is point number 2, that is in relation to the development of bureaucracy. A rational political sphere, that's another thing, and the need for police regulation. So these are 4 very, very important pointers that help us understand why bureaucracy emerged in Europe at a certain point in time. And he also says that as the population grows, you have to have a state apparatus that also has to expand itself. And this is something that contributes to greater bureaucratic development. So growth of population, expansion of the state apparatus, and greater bureaucratic development. However, when we discuss, so ideal type, all core aspects, which is called separation of offices, hierarchy, all of that. So I don't want to go into those. But whenever we are discussing bureaucracy, and I think this is an important point, because if you're talking about the ideal type, then towards the conclusion, you have to also point out the issues with bureaucracy that Weber had. So for example, when we discuss Weber in relation to bureaucracy, one can always refer to what we call some sort of a fundamental ambivalence. So it is pointed out that there is a fundamental ambivalence in Weber's attitude towards bureaucracy. What does this mean? After reading Weber on bureaucracy, you can't really be certain whether Weber is actually in favor of bureaucracy as a legal rational authority, or he is someone who is warning us about the ills, the pathologies that bureaucracy is going to bring about. So despite his discussion of the positive characteristics of bureaucracy, Weber remained painfully aware of the problems that bureaucracy is going to bring to the fore. So he expressed various reservations about bureaucratic organization. So he refers to this thing called over-bureaucratization or bureaucratization, and then of course the larger problem of rationalization. Rationalization is this bigger reference, broader reference, within which bureaucratization is to be understood as some sort of a subset. And he realized that once the world is sort of shall we say, irredeemably rationalized, then there is just no way out of it. So basically, when he talks about advantages of bureaucracy, he is working with an ideal typical image of bureaucracy. But all in all, there is something absolutely fundamentally ambivalent about Weber's take, or Weber's understanding, or Weber's study of bureaucracy. So the ideal type of bureaucracy is something that you are aware of. Now, how does, just one quick also possible anticipated question, how does bureaucracy promote the development of capitalism? So if we have to see connections between bureaucracy and capitalism, how does bureaucracy promote the development of capitalism? So there are 3-4 pointers that Weber draws our attention to. The first is, as long as capitalism requires a market economy, right, in which official business can be executed effectively in accordance with rules of procedure. So as long as capitalism is particular about rules of procedure, bureaucracy is needed, because bureaucracy enhances these operations, enhances the speed of these operations by promoting the regulation of work and a chain of command. So as long as capitalism requires a market economy and a set of rules and procedures, bureaucracy does very well. Capitalism also presupposes a rapid discharge of business activity by adherence to calculable rules. Now, once again, the more bureaucracy develops calculation, capitalism's decisions become more rational and its operations actually become more effective. So more and more calculability. So as capitalism gets into more and more of that, bureaucracy actually is something that comes in more handy, turns things more rational and turns the operations more effective. The more perfectly, point number 3, the more perfectly bureaucracy develops, the more it tends to dehumanize. Well, that's an interesting pointer. Dehumanize or dehumanization. So see a certain connection between alienation and Weber's take on bureaucracy. So the more perfectly, so if bureaucracy were to really, in a flawless way, immaculate way, perfect way, if it were to develop, then what would happen is it would also dehumanize. Weber is absolutely clear. The more bureaucratic a society becomes, the more dehumanization we will have in that society. So the more perfectly bureaucracy develops, the more it tends to dehumanize, and the more it tends to dehumanize, the more it eliminates decision making based on love, on care, on affection, and as a result, this is something that is very much critical to the development of capitalism. Moving completely away from emotions, right? Capitalism cannot afford to be emotive about things. Of course, it makes use of emotions, as you can see in various advertisements, but as such, in its decisions, capitalism has to be completely, shall we say, instrumental in its operations. And lastly, the pointer is, as bureaucracy contributes to specialization of business and commerce, so as bureaucracy sort of puts in more and more in terms of specialization of business and commerce with the trained experts of modern period, it leads to greater efficiency. So of course, this directly promotes capitalism. So anything that contributes to efficiency has a direct repercussion vis-a-vis capitalism. So these are some of the ways in which bureaucracy actually promotes capitalism or contributes to efficient, sort of very promising growth and development of capitalism. But Weber also maintains that while bureaucracy has a connection with capitalism, he was also very clear that it would not disappear in socialism. So even if capitalism were to leave the scene, bureaucracy would not. It would remain. In fact, he pointed out that there will be an increase in terms of bureaucratization in socialist societies, and he was quite right. If you look at Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, it was hyper bureaucratized and so on. Then there is this thing called rationalization, which is again an interesting, important reference. Rationalization. Now, this process of rationalization referred to by Weber is to be understood as some kind of a control, form of a control imposed on the external world, or a certain kind of a mastery over reality, right? So mastery over reality. So basically, Weber has a few things to say about rationalization. The principle of development that is based on, in relation to Western societies, principle of development that is based on the rigorous control of external reality by the active mastery of the natural world. So the more you master the natural world, the more you are getting towards rationalization. Then the growing stress on rational containment of everyday life. Everything needs to be rationally defined, contained, and your conduct needs to be more and more methodical. Life needs to be more and more procedural. Everything needs to be planned, scheduled, organized. So this is also part of rationalization of the world. Then the widespread use of calculation as a strategy for social actions. So every act is a calculated act. Every act is a well thought out act. Everything is calculated. And why everything is calculated? So as to control the outcome of the action. So if I am controlling one thing, I'm also controlling the outcome of whatever I'm doing. So that's also part of rationalization. And lastly, the freeing of all social action from magical thought. So as Weber uses a very interesting phrase, that people are going to get religiously unmusical, and he uses the word the disenchantment of the world. Disenchantment. He uses this fantastic. So basically what happens is people get too much into rational activity, and there is so much calculation, there is so much impersonalization, there is so much means end weighing, that things become absolutely methodical. And as a result, what happens is that there is disenchantment. So he calls it the iron cage of rationality, the iron cage, right? This is something that is also there in the question.